Welcome back to another episode of Surviving Opioids Beyond an Epidemic podcast. On this show, we talk about the opioid crisis as it looks at the ground level. We talk with folks who have researched opioid addiction, assisted in the therapeutic setting, those who have lost family members, and people who have personally lived through their own experience with the crisis and are now thriving on the other end, thriving on the other side of the chaos. This show is for anyone who wants to know that although we have lost many people over the past couple decades, we also do recover. On today's episode, we have Jen Elizabeth. Jen is a harm reduction specialist with the Sidewalk Project in Los Angeles. She's a childhood trauma survivor, an activist, and a sober mom and author living in Southern California. Jen is 10 years removed from an opioid addiction herself and has incredible perspectives and professional experience in the world of harm reduction as it relates to our current crisis. On today's episode, Jen and I talk about the principles of harm reduction, the role compassion plays in the humane care for those still in addiction, and the importance of respecting each individual's autonomy. Jen was a wonderful guest, and I hope that you guys get as much from this conversation as I did. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to episode 2 of the Surviving Opioids Beyond an Epidemic podcast. We have a great guest for you today. You just heard her bio, but she's so much more than that, and I know that you'll enjoy her perspective. So, Jen, welcome to the show. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm so excited to be speaking with you face to face. Just like I was telling you, I followed you for a while now on Instagram. You know, Jen's handle is at Resurrection of Me. Resurrection with the K. I encourage everyone to go give her a follow. It's a great account. You've been one of my favorite voices. You're so raw and honest, and it's just absolutely refreshing, to listen to you, to read the words you write. The recovery community, the addiction community, the harm reduction community, is fortunate to have people like you.
Thanks.
Now I know that you've been working down on Skid Row in LA right now, with the Sidewalk Project. For those of you who don't know, the Sidewalk Project is a group that's socially active in the houseless communities around the world. They do a ton of great stuff. Before you kind of get into what you're doing down there, can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are, what journey has led you to this place of being driven, to help these folks? It's a job that most people simply wouldn't be called to do, I assume.
Right. Yeah. I think I feel really called to it because, I come from the sidewalk, I was born into trauma. I was born into a house of a lot of physical abuse and religious abuse. And then, a lot of untreated mental illness in my family. And, the natural progression of a child who's born into pain like that is just we learn how to carry it somehow.
Yeah.
And when we don't have any support systems or resources or really no resemblance of love, we find ways to numb that pain out. And I've been running from pain long before I ever found drugs. I mean, long before, by, disordered eating and self-harm and, hiding in corners and, trying to be somebody I wasn't. So hopefully that mommy would love me and, all the things. And, searching for love in any way I could find it. So, a pastor began showing me attention. And then, I was really honored, really grateful to find someone that loved me. And then, it turned into, he sexually abused me until I was 10 and all these things. And I think what's really common between my childhood and many, many of the people in the houseless community is that there's certain pipelines that lead you to being unhoused: domestic violence, childhood abuse, childhood sexual abuse, trauma. And so I really feel just so connected to that life, to those struggles. And, when I was 12, I found alcohol, and, it was the first peace I'd ever known. It was, like the answer to every question I ever had about, why I felt the way I felt about who I was.
So that was really the first solution that you found, from
The
ages
very
0 to
first
12, it was mostly pain is
pain.
sort of what I'm hearing. And
Yeah.
then when you were 12, you found alcohol, and it was a treatment, obviously.
It was, honestly, and I say this a lot, and I think a lot of people in recovery and those who are still in addiction can relate to this, is that, alcohol and drugs saved my life at one point.
Yeah.
I was very much planning and coming very close to ending my life at 12.
Wow.
It's actually really frightening, especially being a mother today, and my son is 8, to think about how intricate my plans were becoming.
Yeah.
And so it did save my life at one point. It was something that, I really, and this is something you'll hear a lot from me, is that really, like, the shame was so deep that the only way I've managed for myself is to combat the shame, is to find compassion and actual honor for everything I've ever done to bring myself to today. And so, as strange as it may be to someone listening to this, I actually honor the fact that I found drugs and alcohol at that time. It was a solution at the time. And so from 12 on, I've been using substances chaotically.
And I'd imagine too, so you have like an 8-year-old, and I'd imagine he's your oldest, you said, right?
Right.
So you probably still look at him like a baby, right? He's sort of like your baby, and it's probably gone by pretty quickly. And to think, because I remember, just even like myself at 12, we start to feel like grown-ups. We start to feel like we're getting older. But you are only, so like, there's only a 4-year difference between what you're describing right now in your life and your baby. So like, does that give you kind of like a whole new perspective on just how difficult that is for a little kid? You don't have any coping skill. You don't know very much. You're just a little kid, and you are thrust into this life. Like, so that has kind of been my experience. I have not had the same childhood traumas that you have, but my children are 3 and 5, and I'm starting to look at some things through their lens and think, man, these kids are really at the mercy of their upbringing. I mean, this is like, when you would talk about the word, just even privilege, I usually, when I hear that word, makes a lot of people cringe, but I hear privilege as a life where you're not born into these developmental traumas that then have all types of reverberating effects throughout somebody's life. And I'd imagine that it's probably like a little bit like that with you, with sort of watching like your own kids grow up.
For sure. It's becoming a mother, or a parent in general, is like healing and re-traumatizing all at once, right? It's like, I see my children. My daughter's 4, so she's the exact age as when my abuser began to groom me. And I look at her, and she's such a little baby to me.
Yeah.
And she has such an innocence and such a, it just, she loves dolls and Barbies, and to put on eyeshadow and just all these things. And at some way, it helps me to grieve that I did not have that.
Yeah.
It helps me to grieve. And then on the other side, it helps me to heal, to realize I don't have to give her what I had. I don't have to, she is not going to have to go through what I went through. And with my son, being 8, it's like, at his age, I was already chewing up my food and spitting it out before I swallowed it. It was like I was seeking some sort of control. I had zero control over my body. I had zero control over the chaos in my house. So I would find any type of feeling of safety, and that gave me a feeling of safety, was that I could control something. And I look at him, and he's playing video games, and like, it's just, and again, I grieve over that. And I think it's important that we do that. I think it's important that we grieve over those losses. I mean, there's so much grief that goes along with trauma work and addiction recovery. And I think sometimes we like to pass over that. Like we like to go from victim to survivor, or from, person who uses substances to sober. It's like there's such a spectrum along the way that's important that we honor every single phase. And it's very interesting because, drug use in general, everything in life is on a spectrum, right? Everything in life is on a spectrum. Like nothing is 0 to 100. And so I look at my son, okay, so he's not going to be raised in a home like I was raised in, but there's so many other factors that play along with how he could end up absolutely using drugs, 100%.
Yeah.
No matter what I do, no matter how good I try to make it, or how, safe of an environment he has, there are factors that could play into that. But definitely, it increases your chances tremendously to come from a childhood trauma situation.
Yeah. And I want to talk about, some of that stuff later too.
Yeah.
I actually just felt myself getting super emotional as because I didn't think about it from, you're 4 years old as some of these abuses are starting to come into your life, and you have a 4-year-old daughter. I mean, what more in your face mirror? And I have a 3.5-year-old daughter. So as you're describing this kind of stuff, I'm picturing my own 3.5-year-old daughter. And I mean, these are absolute babies. These people have no control over the adult humans that are around them. And it's such an unbelievable thing. Now I'm talking to you right now, obviously years later. Okay. You have come so far, but so many people, the majority of people who would have been born into that particular circumstances, they do not, they're not sitting here working for the Sidewalk Project and, guesting on podcasts and, kind of out there, like living their life. The trajectory of their life has been changed permanently. And it's a very, very sad thing. I do think that culturally we're starting to, I think at least, starting to maybe put some systems into place. It's so slow, isn't it? Isn't the movement just, it's so painfully slow. Do you think that it's getting better?
I do. I see, it's difficult because I see so much pain and I see so much people being denied access to dignified healthcare and dignified treatment. And, there is a lot of pain in there, but I do see it moving. What I try to remember, so I don't spend a lot of my life angry because it's very difficult, especially with what I do for my work.
Yeah. Because you're right.
Oh yeah, because I see just so much unfair treatment and abuse happening within the systems, within the institutions, within the treatment programs, within religious institutions and all that. I try to remember is that we are unlearning conditioning that has been placed on us for a century, for longer, right? And so it takes time. It takes time to really, for that stuff to be dismantled. And so it keeps me going to remember that. And when I have someone ask me to come on a podcast and say, hey, I would love to hear you share about harm reduction, or it gives me hope that people are willing to have these conversations, even if those conversations, if we don't agree necessarily on everything, or even if those things are like, oh my gosh, I'm afraid maybe, my followers or my community is going to be upset. It's important to see all sides of everything, because I really feel like every single person deserves individualized care. And every single person deserves like crowdsourcing, right? So like I watched this documentary once on Netflix called Inflicted or Diagnosed or something. Anyways, it was about medical people with like medical issues that, one doctor would try to solve or cure and they couldn't. And so instead of saying, well, I can't cure this or solve this, so you are doing something wrong. Like we don't do that in the medical world. We don't judge or say, well, you must be doing something wrong, or you're, beyond my help. What they do is they start reaching out to other specialists, right?
Yeah.
Different types of specialists, and say, this person needs help. And then they all come together. And I really feel like, as far as like the harm reduction community and the recovery community, although I feel like they're the same, right? But it should be the same. They're seen very, as on opposite sides, unfortunately. But is that, we should all be like passing the batons back and forth, because everybody deserves individualized care, every single person.
Yeah.
And so, for me, my entire life, I felt very alone. And I felt very ashamed of who I was. I thought that I was broken, I was beyond repair, I was dirty, I was damaged, and that I could never tell the truth about my life, because, no one would ever want to be near me again. Yeah. And I never want, as long as I'm alive, anyone in my presence to ever feel that way. I just like, not every survivor, not everyone in recovery has to, it does not make my recovery or my being a survivor more valid. It's just something I feel really called to do, is to take the pain that I've had and turn it into a purpose that helps and supports other people along their journey.
And I think that you're doing an incredible job so far. Can you kind of give the listeners like a very, very kind of brief recap, like when you first started getting into opioids, when you were trying to get off them, when you finally got sober, what happened when you, at that process of you becoming, because you're fully abstinent from opioids for the last 10 years, I know.
Yes.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
Can you kind of give like a little overview of what that looked like for you?
Yeah. So I, like I said, from 12 on was drinking. And then, the longer that you run from pain, the bigger it grows, right? So alcohol stopped working as well as it was in the beginning. And I started seeking out other things, when my pain was coming up and the nightmares. And so I started using, different drugs. And I remember I was about 20, I think, and I had to have a wisdom tooth pulled, and I got prescribed Vicodin. That's very commonly how this happens, right? I was
20, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really common, is that, it's not that Vicodin itself is not dangerous, right? But you have someone who has immense trauma, who is already has alcohol use disorder already. And, nobody knows. And I get my wisdom tooth pulled legitimately. I take a Vicodin, and I'm telling you, it was another like aha moment. It's
same.
Oh, fucking freedom is what I felt. It was like, oh, this is it. And so and this was back when they would prescribe an entire 30 Vicodin for one tooth pulling, you know what I mean? For every single one. It was much more free back then. And so I had, the wisdom tooth pulled one at a time, so I could make sure and get a prescription for each time. I had like cortisone shots on my knees. I found reasons to get the pills. And
because this stuff was magic. And we think too, what's interesting, talking to people that have had that experience, and it's so common, the first taste of opioids being, a Tylenol number 3 or a Vicodin, that happens so often. And we think that reaction, that falling in love moment, we sort of think that everybody has that experience. And it turns out that hardly anybody has that experience.
I know.
Most people don't like it.
Isn't that weird?
Most people don't like being, that sedated and constipated and all the other things like that. Enough will make people be like, I don't want to do that anymore. If I'm in pain, I'll do it because I don't want to be in physical pain. But in terms of like me, falling asleep on my couch or nodding off, I don't like that feeling.
Right. Yeah, it's mind-blowing, right? It's like, and this is so important that you just brought that up to me, because this is something I talk about a lot, is that it's very easy for us to project our own addiction experience onto other people's substance use, and everybody's different, right? For me, I took a Vicodin, and it was like instantly, that's it. Yeah. This is it for me. And many, many people do not have that problem or that issue, right?
Yeah.
So and then the pills running out, and then, I found some on the streets, and then it goes on and on to where, at about 23, I was already living on the streets. And I think, and that's another thing, is people assume that I must have become unhoused by being, an IV user. No, I became unhoused just drinking alcohol and taking prescription pills.
Oh, wow.
Because I was just searching to completely erase myself.
Yeah.
My goal was to completely erase myself. My goal was never to party. My drinking and using was never to dance on the tables. It was to erase myself from this earth. And so I ended up, staying on the couch, and I was really, really sick from having no pills. And the guy said, "Oh, I have someone on the way." I assumed it was pills, and it was heroin and a needle. And at that time, I had no care for myself. Number one, I did not have any self-worth whatsoever. And I was so sick from, I know, what that's like to be, withdrawing from opioids. It's horrendous. Yeah, and I just put my arm out. Just help me. I feel so sick. And that was it from that moment on.
So you weren't even hesitant with the needle. You didn't, some people smoke it for a little bit, or just kind of right to the main deal.
Right to the main deal. And so that's where my life was until I was 35, which is when I got sober.
Oh, wow. So that was the next 12 years of your life.
Next 12 years of my life was an IV heroin and meth user.
Yeah.
And, living in cars, under bridges, eating from garbage cans. I just, the whole thing, in and out of institutions and county jails, having people, kick me off of the front porch of their stores. Nobody wanted to be around me. I had abscesses all over and track marks. My teeth fell out. And as horrible as that sounds, and it was a terrible time. Nothing felt more terrifying to me than to stop and look at my childhood.
Yeah.
I just could not. I was willing to die to avoid that.
Yeah.
And so at 35, at 34, I was arrested again. And this time I was arrested for distribution of heroin, which is very, very easy to do as well. But distribution is a very broad sentence.
Yeah, you don't have to be pushing kilos.
You do not. But once you get that, it changes the whole trajectory of the way that the court sees you. You no longer are quote unquote loser or sick person or whatever. You become a bad person.
Yeah.
Now you're a
criminal.
Now I'm a criminal, entirely a criminal.
Yeah.
And so I was sentenced to state prison. And
so then you came out of there. I know that you have some experience with the 12 steps too. Were you, is that how you got sober? So were you introduced, to the 12 step fellowships through prison, or did you come out and kind of hear about them? How did that happen?
Introduced to the 12 steps along the way, being arrested and like Prop 36 and all these different outpatients and, all the different levels you go through as you go through the court system, and so I was introduced to it, and it was at that time, even just 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that was really all there was. It really wasn't and that's not a bad thing, but that's really all there was. And actually it's, still has the monopoly on recovery in general. It's that's pretty much the most common way that people, go, like most common meetings, the most common things that courts will sentence you to is to have your 12-step card signed and whatever.
No, I had to do that.
I did too, many times.
Yeah.
And so, in prison, I used in prison, and then about halfway into my prison sentence, I just had a moment, although I was using, it was not as plentiful. So there was some time for the cloud to kind of clear a little bit. I used so much that I lost the ability to read. So that's the extent of my using. It's like it really affected me so deeply that I could no longer put letters together to make words together to make sentences. And so in that,
and you're such an incredible writer. So I mean, that is saying something if it got to that point.
It really is. I mean, thank you. But yeah, it's amazing to me how the brain heals.
Yeah, I know. I feel the same way. Yeah, it really is
amazing, truly. And so in that time, like the brain started to heal a little bit. And, I had a moment where, and this was May 1st, 2011, that's my recovery date. And I was sitting in my cell and I, surrounded by, I had a metal bunk. I didn't own a pair of pants. My teeth were gone, most of my teeth, just all the things. And it just like, I was looking out this little window at like the small patch of grass that we used to like walk around called the yard. And
the yard.
It just hit me that like, this is going to be the sum total of my life.
Yeah.
And unless I do something, and maybe, just maybe, I don't want to die alone in a riverbed as a transient. Yeah. Like maybe. And it was just a tiny spark, just a little spark. And that's why it's so important, and why I meet people where they're at, is because these little seeds of kindnesses matter. And even if they don't change someone's path immediately, they matter, they stay. And so that little tiny spark kept me going. And so from that date, or the day before, whatever, forward, I have never touched or used a substance again, or, alcohol, drugs, whatever.
I mean, that's incredible. Sometimes there's, because I want to ask you this kind of one specific question, because I get asked this a lot, and I feel like the listeners would, kind of want like an opinion on it. Sometimes there's some controversy about whether, with regard to the 12 steps, whether opioid addicted people who don't, maybe identify as having had like an alcohol addiction should go to AA. Okay, so I know that this does not fit your example because you are saying this was kind of born, from an alcohol use disorder, like when you were around 12, and then it kind of progressed, versus NA, some of the other fellowships. And in fact, that one of like the biggest names out there, and I've listened to to him speak, like Clancy I. Clancy actually ran that like midnight mission down there on Skid Row, for I think for like 50 years, right? And he was pretty vocal that, folks with like heroin addictions, for example, who don't also identify, as being an alcoholic or just having had an alcohol addiction, should not go to AA. He said that over and over. How do you feel about that?
I think here's my thoughts, is that in the beginning of recovery, it is very important to be around people that resemble yourself.
Yeah.
So in the very beginning, I think that it really matters to be around people that have similar stories. In the beginning of recovery, it is about the drugs and alcohol, right? Once you get through the beginning, you realize it has nothing to do with drugs and alcohol. Yeah. Recovery has nothing to do with substances. It's everything about the whys, right? But in the beginning, it is about that. And so it is important, I think, and my experience was that to sit in a meeting where I am unable to talk about some of the things that happen as a other type of drug user, where I'm only allowed to speak about alcohol, or I have to replace the word with alcohol to be accepted, made me feel more ashamed, or that I'm on some sort of lower level, like there was some hierarchy. Now, today, although I'm not really active in the 12 steps anymore, I can go to any meeting and identify. Yeah. I can fit in, I could go to, SA, CA, it wouldn't even matter, because it's the underlying feelings that I identify with. The substance or the actual addiction, what it's to, doesn't even freaking matter.
But that's you 10 years into the program. And you're saying this was not you 10 days.
No, at 10 days, or, I was in prison at that time, but first getting paroled and having I had to go back there because that was part of my parole. It was super important for me to have a fellowship of people that had similar experiences. Now, I don't think it's beneficial to just sit in there and talk about, I used to slam heroin, and blah, 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 which can sometimes happen. But it is important to be able to speak about that if that is something that helps you in some way versus having to switch, which is something what I do, now being 10 years, occasionally 12-step meetings ask me to come speak, which still blows my mind, which is another sign of hope for me, because I don't identify as an addict or an alcoholic. I say I'm a person in recovery. And you know what? They're actually super accepting of that today. Some of them are. But I will, out of respect for that particular fellowship, will replace, what I'm speaking about, and use the word alcohol or whatever, because to me, it makes no difference. But in the beginning, no, I think it's important that we have people that are mirror us so that we know that we're not alone, or we're not defective, or we're not lower than, or, and that's typical with alcohol versus other drugs. This happens in policies. This happens in initiatives on a government level, on a society level, is that there is a difference between people who drink alcohol, whether problematically or not, and people who use other drugs.
Yeah,
and
one is certainly more socially accepted. That's there's no question about that.
Absolutely. One is more protected. One has laws to protect them, and one
is more legal.
One is more legal. Exactly. So and that actually bleeds into recovery. Absolutely.
So I completely agree, actually, with your take, on the different 12-step fellowships. That has also been my experience. So kind of moving on a little bit, I could talk to you about all these topics for a long time, but like in the interest of time, I want to get to some other stuff too. It's been said that all addictions are born out of trauma. Sure, there are like genetic inheritance patterns that will increase the predisposition, but we know that predisposition is not predetermination. And I sort of feel like nowhere is that more true than the opioid addictions, all of them. But I just see it a lot, and I see it on a larger scale sometimes. So, you're pretty open about like your own trauma history. Can I ask, what are some of the ways that you have found successful, to treat like your own past traumas, and then two, in what ways do your own unhealed trauma wounds, still seem to complicate your everyday life with 10 years complete absence?
So the first thing I'll say is that sobriety does not heal trauma.
Right.
So my being abstinent has nothing to do with trauma work. Nothing. The only thing that sobriety did is kind of give me a shift to where I had more of an awareness of how deep my trauma really was. And about 2 years into sobriety, I again started contemplating ending my life. I was pregnant with my son. And this is where becoming a mother really, really brought back so much of my childhood and the way that my mother abused me. And, it really thrust me into like full throttle, like it's time to face some stuff because you don't have a choice. It's coming. And at that time, although I was 2 years sober, although I had, worked my steps several times, and I had sponsees, and I was doing the deal, right?
Yeah.
But I was doing the 12-step deal, which is not a trauma-informed deal, which is totally fine. That's not what they're there for. I don't think anyone in the 12 steps claims to be a mental professional community. It's just not a mental health community. This is what it's there for.
Fellowship, right?
Right. And so I began having nightmares, and, what I didn't know was, CPTSD. And again, like I said, starting to contemplate, I can't do this. I'm not meant to be a mother.
So into sobriety, right? This is
2 years,
2-3 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Into sobriety, full abstinence, in a completely involved in a 12-step fellowship. Right. And again, because I was not facing or doing anything about the trauma, which is really what needed to happen. That's really what my addiction was all about, has always been about, was running from my childhood and not knowing how to process that. And so I remember reaching out to some people in the 12 steps and are wanting to share about, you know, childhood abuse and stuff. And I was told that was an outside issue. That is not something we talk about here, which is unfortunate. Now, I have found a progression in that people, even in the 12 steps, are starting to realize that this is really important. Everything that brought us to those seats should be just talked about, right? But at that time, and in these particular groups, because every meeting is different, these particular ones, I was pretty much told that if I'm still suffering, I'm not working things hard enough. I'm not it works if you work it.
I was told that too at about
right?
about a year. Yeah.
It's messed up. It can it's harmful, but you know, this is again something
you're not praying hard enough. You know, you're not
praying hard enough, you're not working your steps hard enough, you're not being honest enough. What do you know, whatever. Anyways, so I remember sitting, and this is just as monumental for me as the day that I stopped using drugs, was that I was sitting and it was nighttime and I was all alone and I was in front of my computer and I decided, you know, like I was at the crossroads, like either I'm going to end both of our lives, my son and myself, because I am just too damaged to function. Obviously, I don't know how to do recovery right. I should be happier. I should be more healed. I should. Or I'm going to try to figure out what's going on with me. And I remember Googling sexual abuse. It blew my fucking world.
So for the first time, really, in your life, I mean, you're talking that you're in your mid 30s.
Yep.
You have been 2 years abstinent from this stuff. You're working like a program of recovery inside like a 12-step group. And that's the first time that you even thought, you know, maybe these experiences are still affecting my life. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
I had never, ever thought that I was abused. I thought I was a participant. And that is what silence and shame and grooming does, is that if you don't fight, if you don't scream, if you don't tell anybody, then you must have liked it. You must have asked for it. You must have wanted it. I was 4.
Yeah.
5. Okay. But still, this is what happens. This is so common in survivors, especially of childhood sexual abuse, is that if we don't kick and scream, because we're terrified, we're either terrified or we have no love or affection at home. And it actually gives us something to be around someone who wants to play with our hair and do those things, right? We don't have a clue. Is that then it shifts into from a victim to a participant. And so you never, ever get to that point where you think it's an abuse situation, right? And so this is another reason why I want to make it clear, and I hope everybody understands, is that the 12-step model is not trauma informed, because it can be very re-traumatizing to work your steps. And like you're on the 4th step, if you think that a sponsor who's just a peer, right? It's just another peer, is somebody that is equipped or trained or educated in any way to respond to something that serious, is devastating.
I'm so glad that you're saying this. You know, this is something that I bring up a lot as well. It can be
absolutely devastating, to the point that that person who is giving their 4th or 5th step, whatever, that they will go back out and use and possibly end their lives.
Yeah.
And so it's
That's
just important that it's important, and it's nothing against the 12. I think people think I talk bad about the 12 steps. It's nothing against the 12 steps. However, the reality is that people sitting in those rooms have deep trauma.
Yeah.
95% of them have deep childhood trauma that they have never spoken about, even at 10 years sober, 20 years sober, you know, old timers that they've never talked about, and that they think that their recovery is as good as it gets, but they're still having interpersonal problems. They're still having anxiety. They're still having depression. They're still having nightmares. They still have hypervigilance and all these things, right? Because it's too deep. It's too much. Now, if they come out and share that with someone who is not in any way informed or trained on how to respond, and they respond in a re-traumatizing way, it can fucking devastate somebody.
Or just like dismissive.
dismissive,
Just
saying forgive your abuser. I mean, there's
that was then, this is now. Yeah.
Right. Let it go. All these things, right? It can be devastating. So this is what happened to me, right? I had some responses that were not trauma informed. They were dismissive. They told me I should forgive my abuser and move on because that's the answer to all this and all this stuff, right? It just made me feel like the lowest piece of crap in the world. I Googled sexual abuse and it blew my whole world open because I found link after link of people speaking openly about the things I thought I could never tell anybody. Yeah. And then I found all these symptoms. I was like, oh my God, that's me. That's me. That's
you never
me.
told anybody?
No.
In those 30 years?
In those 30 years.
That was yours. Wow.
That was mine because
so
I felt that I was a dirty little girl. Something was definitely wrong with me that I did that. And I also feared I would abuse my children.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I thought that I was sexually perverse. And what if I do that to my son? And, it's why it's so important to talk about this on the open, because there could be somebody listening that feels that way. And I want them to know that that's so common to have that fear.
So I'm listening to you talk, and now like originally, I thought that like the only way, okay, you're kind of talking about like abusing like your kids, passing it on. Like originally, I thought that the only way to pass on like an addiction even to a child, is for that child to see it and experience it with their own eyes, for it to be modeled to them, basically. So like if I'm abstinent from this addiction, then there's zero chance that I could be passing that on. Now I've listened to Gabor Mate and a handful of others. He's incredible. If anybody's listening and you're not familiar with Gabor Mate, to watch some of his YouTube lectures. He's got a few books out. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts is the book specifically about addiction. I would strongly encourage anybody. But he says, and as do others, that the developmental trauma, will most likely get passed on if it's not acknowledged and actively treated. So like for me personally, that has been my biggest sense of urgency that I've really felt over the last couple of years, because I know how crucial these first 3 to 5 years are for little kids. And I have a 3-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son. In what ways are you kind of like directly aware of this in your day-to-day life, and where do you see like your own childhood trauma pop up when you're interacting with your 2 little kids today?
I think especially with my son, right? There were several years of his life, the first several years of his life, that I was literally treading water in trauma. And it affected my parenting. I never took him to the park. We stayed inside. I was terrified to let anybody near him, any adult. I was, and this is very common too, like the pendulum swings, right? So every single thing I went through, I wanted to do the exact opposite. Yeah. And so what I did was overprotect and over smother and over love, not over love, over, coddle. Because but what I did was then hinder him a little bit. And he became he would hide behind my legs if we went into public. He became very socially, like a social anxiety and all these
What age
things.
are you talking about now?
Like I'm talking about from birth to around 3 is when I really, my trauma work began to really open up and have worked through a lot of deep stuff. And so it's interesting because, I also host the Sober Mom Squad, and a lot of those moms are coming in having drank on multiple levels while parenting, right? And they have a lot of shame and guilt and all this and remorse and all these things. And so my having been sober before I became a mom, I always remind them that is, sobriety is not like some sort of badge. It's not some sort of end goal, right? Like it was sober. I parented through a lot of, resolve trauma as well, because I was still having a relationship with my family, with some of my abusers. And so, I had, a lot of things I did, I know affected my son.
Yeah.
And so today, for me, it's like, I'm so proud of myself, honestly, to be where I'm at today, consider from where I was. And I don't mean where I was when I was on the streets. I mean, from where I was as a sober person in the beginning, because I was just completely debilitated and stuck. I could not see my way out of all the things. And it's taken me a long time. And this is a road I'll always be on, the healing journey. There is no healed, right? Like, there's always healing. And that used to really scare me and be like, oh my God, that's terrible. You mean this shit never ends, But now today it's like, that's incredible, because like, the woman that's sitting on this recording right now, I don't even want to recognize her next year. It's like, I want to always be moving forward and always becoming more comfortable in my skin and more firm in my footing. And I do pick up things that I do sometimes with my kids, that I can't really pinpoint what they are. They're more of feelings on the inside that I have, sometimes fears. I never want them to feel like there's something wrong with them. I always want them to feel good about who they are. And at least in this house, that they will never be turned away or said they're sinners, or, all the things that I went through. But it does take, I always have to work on myself. I do a lot of inner child meditations where I take like pictures of myself when I was about 5. Oh, it's around here somewhere, but I do this every day. And, I look at her and then I close my eyes and I envision myself walking over to her, and she's sitting on the floor by herself in the corner, like always. And I pick her up and I twirl her in the sunshine. And I tell her she is love and light and perfect, and none of that was her fault. And that together we are safe now, and I'll never leave her alone. And I do this every day. And I write, and I do a lot of trauma work. I've done a lot of trauma work with therapists, and it's very unfortunate. And I hope this changes, is that, it's very easy for me to sit here and talk about trauma work when I have access to trauma work. And so many people do not. Yeah.
You talk about, so this kind of segues into the next, topic that I want to hear, some of your thoughts on. You talk about a lot about meeting people where they're at, and that seems to be an approach that a lot of, some of the more progressive institutions are taking up these days, which is to say that forcing full abstinence, or some other method that our society sort of claims to be the quote unquote like right course of action, is an inhumane way to treat an adult human being. Like there's no other chronic disorders that if people don't respond to treatment the way that we want, that we brutalize them and criminalize them and ostracize them. But that we also know that when somebody becomes chemically dependent on anything, but like particularly opioids, there are parts of the brain involved with, like the rational functioning and like the executive functioning that kind of go offline, and some of those lower, more primitive brain regions of survival take over. So at what point do you think that folks, they would actually benefit from like a little bit of forceful encouragement to address their addictions? Or do you think that it's not our job ever to do that? And if abstinence or even just recovery in general, is something that they desire, that they'll sort of just kind of come to that conclusion on their own?
I think it goes back to like what I said in the beginning, is that everybody is an individual, right? Everybody has an individual story, an individual childhood, an individual, everything is their path to how they've gotten to where they are today is very individual, right? And so I think, unfortunately, what we do is we lump people into a sum of quote unquote addict or quote unquote, abstinent, right? It's like there's one or the other, and we lose this whole sea of differences. And I don't agree with ever approaching anyone and demanding that they have abstinence or desire for abstinence as the way that they qualify for healthcare,
Yeah.
the way they qualify for dignified treatment, the way that they have to earn, like it's some sort of way that they have to earn, supplies so that they have safer use, so that they live and they live as healthy as possible. That I never agree with. I think everybody's different. And like I said, and I think that I've never seen anyone shamed into or coerced really into like a full thriving recovery.
Yeah.
I've seen people comply, and then that seems to appease on the outside, but I don't see it lasting long really until they find that own thing. And so I don't know, the word tough love is strange to me. I don't think love should be tough. And now I just think that, there's such a weird assumption that, and I think this might be our next question, but is that harm reduction is seen as enabling people to continue using drugs, right?
Yeah.
By some people. And this is what I always say, is that if you think that people having access to the things they need to use as safely as possible is the deciding factor on whether they continue using or not, then you do not understand addiction at all.
Right. That's exactly right.
People will use regardless, and at multiple levels, right? Harm reduction, you work with the houseless community. So we're talking about not everyone in the houseless community uses, but the ones that do, the use is quite chaotic. Okay, so that's that. But there are people that use on many different levels that have jobs, that have, and I know that's difficult to understand, especially when we come from where we come from, to understand that, God, you mean people can use drugs like recreationally and like do this for lengths of time and be, and it is possible. It is, I've seen it. I see it every day. But I think everyone deserves the right to have autonomy. Yeah. And even if that means that in their, adultness, that they want to use drugs on some level, I don't think that it's right that we ostracize them or judge them or make it a moral issue somehow or all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Slowly, like it does seem like the country is kind of waking up to the absolute failure of the drug war. It's a joke. Like the best book that I've found about it is Johann Hari's Chasing the Scream. Mm-hmm. So good. He really details it brilliantly, in my opinion. Like nobody's winning this war unless they want to consider the prison systems and the criminal justice system winning the war. Maybe they are. But even with harm reduction, like we had, like not far from where I live, in Philadelphia, South Philly, they almost had, safe injection site just like this past year, and I thought it was just about to happen, and then everybody kind of shut it down. The local residents were just not having it, and like you were saying, a lot of that was, about enabling addiction. They thought. I don't know. I mean, I guess you probably hear this all the time. If you give somebody clean needles, somehow that's going to, like allow them to remain a heroin addict longer, right? Like you hear stuff like that all the time.
It's ridiculous, because I'll tell you from my own experience, that we had, back then, harm reduction was not as big as it is now. I never had anyone approach me with a harm reduction, with a, syringe service, nothing. Right. Yeah. So when I say I used chaotically, I mean, it was constant. I was constantly using. And I would use needles that I found. I would share needles. I would use 2 pennies to resharpen them. I mean, I did all kinds of things that were so excessively dangerous. And, I would never, it's like the thing I really feel is that here's the deal with like safer consumption sites, or, like I have a syringe service program, all these things, is that I think people people's view. And I'd love everyone to come out. If you live in Los Angeles, come out and volunteer with me. Let me show you what actually happens there. Because what happens is that I hug these people, and I'm their friend, right? And we build a relationship and we build a trust. And they show so much courage, and it is an act of self-love to care about yourself and your community enough to say, you know what, here's my used needles so that no one else uses them. Perhaps I have HIV, perhaps I have hepatitis C, perhaps I don't want to get those things, which is huge, right? Here's those. I'm going to trust you to give me the new ones. And we continually have this relationship. And then there's so much other stuff going on, so many other resources. I have linkage to Suboxone, to methadone, to mental health care, to drug treatment. I have linkage to lots of things available. And as that relationship grows, they start to trust me, and I trust them. And then things start to evolve. Things definitely start to evolve. But if they never do, they still are human beings and deserve to use as safely as possible. That is my belief. And I don't know why, or I do know why, but why is it, I'll just ask this question. Why is it that when it comes to the alcohol industry, we care about people who drink alcohol so much that we make it legal? We have the labels on the bottles that tell you exactly how much alcohol is in there, how much everything's in there. So you can make an informed decision to buy which alcohol you want to buy. You know how strong everything is. We have, designated driver nights. We have all these things. I mean, these are big initiatives, right? We have free Uber nights. We do all these things to respect people that drink alcohol. But when it comes to anything else, we expect them to be in destitution, complete destitution. And that's how they're going to stop. It's not working. No. It's not working.
No. And I feel like chasing the scream basically answers your question. So your question is like, why do we sort of criminalize one and kind of glorify the other? I feel like that entire book is an answer to that question. Right. Again, anybody who's interested in the drug war, in addiction, whether it's opioid addiction, it's just the crises that are going on now, read that book. It really kind of nicely plays out exactly how we got to this point. Because we didn't start getting to this point in 2014 as the fentanyl boom started coming in. I mean, this was many decades, over a century in the making. All right, so we're kind of really running out of time. I want to you kind of touch on two things before I let you go here, if that's okay. So
yeah,
so I got into social media like almost 2 years ago. I had not done any of that stuff before, and originally I thought it was a pretty useless medium for recovery, to be honest. I mean, I just figured, this is like before I got into it. Yeah, I figured it's just all fake and ego driven, which is kind of stuff that I was trying to get away from at the time anyway. But I have since changed my mind on that. I mean, social media has given me the chance to connect with some awesome people like you, right? That hear perspectives that I otherwise wouldn't have, and really just to work through a lot of like my own ideas. Like there is something about kind of writing it all down in a little daily bite-sized post that has helped me work through some of my own thoughts. But one thing that has become painfully clear is the amount of division and the infighting, okay, if you will, like within the recovery community itself. You've certainly written a lot about this. Can you tell me, from your perspective, two questions. One, do you see that it's getting worse, better, staying the same? Okay, because you've been in this space a little bit longer than I have. And then two, why do you think that talking about alternative approaches to full abstinence is so triggering for so many people?
I'll tell you, I can answer the second question first. Why do questions. Right? The second question is, I believe it's fear.
Yeah.
It's fear, not only sometimes from a good place. They have fear for that other person. Okay. This has worked for me. So if you dare venture off in any, oh my God, you're down doomsday Bill, right?
Yeah.
Also, it's fear that people feel for some reason that if they validate another person's wellness, okay, I'm going to call it wellness because I don't think all recovery has to be abstinence. If they validate another type of wellness, it somehow invalidates their own.
Yeah.
I don't know why we feel this way, but it is very common. It's like to say, we just can't accept it. We can't accept it. And I think it's a lot of fear, and it is ego. I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of ego. I think we're afraid to say that some people, many people do very well on Suboxone for a long time. Mm. Now, just because somebody else doesn't mean that somebody else can. Like, I feel like we just, it's so vast. Everything is on a spectrum. And I think that we need to really learn to like honor that and honor everybody's different journey. And it's okay to say, hey, you know what? I was on Suboxone and it was the worst for me. I absolutely did not do it. But you know what? I'm so happy it's working for you. Like we need to do that with all aspects of recovery in general. And do I think it's gotten better? Maybe a little bit. I do feel I'll tell you from my own experience, is that I have been somewhat canceled from many, many, many different recovery platforms, podcasts. I've had my podcast episodes removed from their playlist. I've been uninvited or no longer invited to speak at different like recovery crawls and, all these things that I always was able to for the past, however many years. These things have never happened to me by anyone in any other fellowship except the 12 steps. Never in Smart Recovery. And I know many people in Smart Recovery and have done lots of things with people with organizations that do Smart Recovery or refugee recovery or whatever it happens to be, only in the 12 steps. And I think that's just because it has been so long and so ingrained that is the only way to go, that they are the hardest ones to kind of soak in and accept that there is other ways to do this thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there is an indoctrination, obviously, that, that kind of happens. And maybe like you were saying before, maybe like a lot of that needs to happen if somebody's going to have like long-term success in those programs. They really do need to completely buy in from the beginning and like I did, for example, like it sounds like you did. And then I think once you are completely bought in, the likelihood that, maybe several years in, that you are going to start opening up your mind to some of it's probably, well, it is. I mean, this was also like my experience because I didn't used to think like this 5-6 years ago. It is very threatening, because okay, so, for example, for the first 30 plus years of my life, I was not a certain way. I finally found something where things seem to be getting better. It is scary to question that, because what if in the questioning of that, I somehow, skip past the willingness to want to continue living this life, and then I sink back into what was going on before. I mean, I feel like I can speak to this because, because this has been like my experience also. I mean, I had a horrible opioid addiction. I finally was able to break free of that. So it is scary to think that maybe some of these other ideas will shake the foundation of the one thing that has not been my experience, and that has not been your experience. And there are other people, but yeah, I agree that fear is certainly at the root of that. So
there's a lot of fear mongering that goes on, right?
Oh,
there's a lot. And so then people are terrified to follow their hearts in any way. And they're definitely terrified to speak out in the open about it. And so that's why I think it's important that there are people willing to speak out. There are people willing to have the courage to say, you know what, I don't think that this is necessarily helpful to anyone to constantly be spreading this. And even though, I get some pretty crappy stuff, I get more people saying, thank you. Thank you for saying that, because, I've been going through this, or I've been going through that. And I really appreciate having a space where I can feel accepted. That is what we need. Like, this is why the stigma inside the recovery community is way more harmful than the stigma from the outside world, because this is where people who use drugs on any level, where people who are in recovery at any degree should feel the safest, is with us. They should never feel like they can't speak out because they're on Suboxone, or like they don't have a voice because they're still using, but they're trying to moderate, or whatever it happens to be. Like, this is the space. Like, nowhere else can they find this. And so when they come into a recovery meeting or platform or whatever, and they're told that they are not valid, that they're not accepted, or that their voice doesn't matter, or that, their baby steps aren't big enough, or whatever it is, it completely
trading one addiction for another,
whatever, whatever we want to say, instead of celebrating, even just being there. Even if someone is using on whatever level and they show up somewhere to just hear something, or they want to share maybe something that they're feeling, it's like, we need to like celebrate that. This is the space to do that. This is the space. And we spread a lot of fear, and we live in a lot of fear. And instead of being concerned of whether someone's recovery has abstinence or not, or whatever it happens to be, I would like us all to take a look at our own recovery and wonder why we're spending it in so much fear. Because I don't want to live in recovery and be terrified to do anything. That's not life. For me.
That is continued fear, and the goal eventually is to slowly start moving away from there. As you were just kind of giving like your answer, so I was playing back through some of like my own experiences, and same as you. Okay, I try to speak as objectively and like without motive as possible. And there are times where I will upset the 12-step community. There's times where I upset these folks, and it's not, I'm just speaking from what I've seen, learned, and experienced. And like what has happened to me too, inside some of these 12-step groups, is I will share something from the floor, right? And it's a little bit kind of like against maybe like the mainstream thought. There is some pressure to kind of speak the lingo, so to speak, speak the 12-step way. And I've said some things, and there are some of the old timers, got 20, 25, 30 plus years. These guys are laughing. I can see them kind of like looking at each other, rolling their eyes. And then that didn't empower me to speak more. What that did was it just taught me right away, don't speak like that anymore. Don't say that kind of stuff. I think that everybody who's recovering from any kind of addiction to some extent, is also dealing with some like codependent tendencies. And I feel like, there's a lot of pressure to conform and to all have the same thoughts and the same belief pattern. So I think that is certainly a part of that problem, as well.
It is. And I just think we put a lot of emphasis on time, on sober time. Like, so since someone has 20 years, I know people that have 6 months that are doing so much better in their skin than people that have 20 years who have just been sitting in meetings and judging and pounding and not doing any other work on themselves. And they're living they're just horrendous. I mean, it just looks, and divorces over and over, and their children don't speak to them, but they have 20 years. So this is like somebody
everybody knows it. God damn it,
and everybody fucking knows it. But then there's someone who has 6 months on Suboxone who's doing trauma work and like really looking at the way that they feel about themselves and how that's bled into how they treat other people. And it's like, whoa. Why is it that we put so much emphasis on time? That's why I have done away with the before and after pictures. For me, it's either you're going to see me before, because that is me. That's who's speaking right now.
Right. It's the same person.
It is the same person. This You are speaking to her right now. In fact, a lot of the things I feel in my heart come from that time.
Yeah.
They don't come from me being in recovery. They come from then. They come from my experiences then of being, raped under bridges and, eating from garbage cans and, using socks that I found on the floor of a dirty bathroom because I was on my period and I had no means. I mean, she's the one who's taught me so much about how to treat people today. And so I am the same person. And yes, I'm really proud of my recovery. Yes, I'm really proud to have hit 10 years. Yes, I've worked really hard to get here, but it does not change my worth as a human being whatsoever.
I think that is beautifully said. Jen, thank you so much. I could listen to you talk harm reduction and opioid addiction and recovery all day. I hope that the listeners enjoy this as much as I did. Jen has written a book. It's called Shape of a Woman. It's available on Amazon at your local book dealers, where she goes into more detail about the topics that we discussed today. Can you tell everybody where else they can find you?
So I try not to spread myself too thin. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, everything Resurrection of Me, but mainly Instagram. I'm redoing my website, but it's resurrectionofme.com. You can go seek out the Sidewalk Project and see what we do there. A lot of the activism and, harm reduction work. I have a special program to support women who engage in sex work on the streets. Just all of it. It's just about really loving and supporting and empowering people to be whoever they are at that time. And I also host meetings at the Sober Mom Squad, which is a support group for moms who are living or just exploring an alcohol-free life. So you can go check that out.
Well, thanks. I wish you continued success in your career. I have no doubt, that you'll continue having an impact locally in Southern California, and also on a wider scale with your writings and your social media presence and Sober Mom Squad. It's really a pleasure interacting with you. I'm thankful for your time today. Thankful for all that you're doing to help at the ground level, and I hope that you personally continue to thrive in your own recovery beyond this epidemic. All right, thanks, Jen.
I appreciate you having me on.
All right, take care.